Today, April 11th, 2026, something is happening in Islamabad that could either stop a war or restart it within days. Iran and the United States are sitting in separate rooms inside a hotel in Pakistan's capital, with Pakistani diplomats physically walking proposals between the two delegations because the two sides still refuse to be in the same room. This is the highest level direct engagement between Washington and Tehran since the 2015 nuclear deal, and it is happening under a ceasefire that is already cracking before the ink is dry. The Strait of Hormuz, the waterway that carries roughly 20% of the world's oil and gas, is still not open. Not really. Just two ships passed through it yesterday. Before the war started, between 130 and 160 ships crossed every single day. Iran suggested this week it may have placed sea mines in the waterway. Trump went on Truth Social and said Iran is doing a, quote, very poor job of allowing oil through. He called it dishonorable. His team is now on the ground in Islamabad, and he has already warned publicly that if talks fail, the United States will, in his words, finish it off one way or another. The ceasefire expires on April 22nd. That is 11 days from now. If you've been trying to understand what is actually at stake here, not the headlines, but the system underneath them, hit like and subscribe right now and drop a comment below. Do you think these talks end in a deal, or does the shooting start again? We read every single one. Now let me tell you what is actually happening in that hotel in Islamabad. Iran's delegation is 71 people. 71. That is not a negotiating team. That is a government in transit. It includes Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a former commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the head of Iran's Supreme National Defense Council, the governor of Iran's central bank, and multiple members of parliament. Tehran is treating this like a full state-level summit, not a preliminary round of talks. That tells you something about how seriously Iran is taking this moment. The United States sent Vice President J.D. Vance, Senior Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. Trump gave them what he called clear guidelines before they boarded the plane. And Pakistan, the country hosting all of this, is doing something it has never done at quite this scale before. It is acting as a physical go-between for two nuclear-armed adversaries who are negotiating the terms of a ceasefire, while one of them still has not fully reopened the most important oil shipping lane on the planet. Here is where things stand on the ground right now, factually. Iran has publicly stated it will not begin negotiations until two conditions are met. A ceasefire in Lebanon, where Israel continued strikes this week that killed hundreds, and the release of Iranian assets frozen abroad. The United States says Lebanon is not part of this ceasefire. Israel says the same. Iran and Pakistan as mediator say it is. That disagreement alone is enough to collapse these talks before they formally begin. And yet both delegations are in the building. Both sides made the trip. That means something. It means neither side has fully decided to walk away. Yet. What this suggests is that we are inside one of those narrow windows that history sometimes opens between the end of one phase of a conflict and the beginning of the next. The window is not wide, and it is closing fast. In my view, the reason this moment is so consequential goes beyond the two countries sitting in those rooms. It is about the system that breaks if they fail. More than 600 vessels are currently stranded in the Middle East Gulf region, according to Lloyd's List, the Maritime Intelligence Service. They estimate that even if the strait reopened completely tomorrow, it would still take more than 10 days just to clear the backlog of ships. Oil is trading above $95 a barrel. Inflation data in the United States already shows the war's fingerprints. Asian economies, Japan, South Korea, India, the Philippines, are all absorbing a supply shock with no immediate relief visible. Pakistan itself, the country brokering this deal, is facing one of the worst economic crises in its modern history. It has a stake in this outcome that goes well beyond diplomatic prestige. And sitting at the center of all of it is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage of water 21 miles wide at its tightest point that Iran has transformed into the most powerful economic weapon any single country has deployed in decades. This is the situation as of today. And to understand why Iran is at the table at all, and why the war could still restart within days, you need to understand what happened in the 40 days before the ceasefire, because that is where this story actually begins. Here is a detail that almost no one in Western media has stopped to explain properly. Pakistan has a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia. It signed it on September 17, 2025, just 5 months before this war began. That pact states that any aggression against either country shall be considered an aggression against both. And Pakistan also shares a 900-kilometer border with Iran. It is home to the second largest population of Shia Muslims in the world, after Iran itself. Protests erupted in Karachi, Lahore, and Islamabad the day after US and Israeli strikes killed Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei on February 28th. Hundreds of protesters charged the US consulate in Karachi. At least 20 people were killed in demonstrations across the country. So Pakistan, simultaneously, is treaty-bound to Saudi Arabia, shares a border and deep religious ties with Iran, has rebuilt a working relationship with Trump's White House, and is facing one of the worst economic crises in its modern history, made significantly worse by the war it is now trying to stop. This is not a comfortable position. This is a tightrope walk with no safety net above a fire. And yet, Pakistan pulled off something that no other country managed to do. It got both sides to show up. The story of how that happened starts with a relationship between Pakistan's army chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, and Donald Trump. Munir had built a direct line to Trump over the past year, partly through Pakistan's arrest of the suspect behind the Abbey Gate bombing in Kabul in 2021, which killed 13 American service members. That goodwill mattered when it counted. On the evening of April 7th, with Trump's own deadline approaching, he had publicly threatened that a whole civilization would die that night if Iran didn't come to a deal. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif called Trump and asked him to extend the deadline by 2 weeks to let diplomacy work. Trump agreed. He announced the ceasefire hours later and said he had done it based on conversations with Sharif and Munir. Iran's foreign minister confirmed the ceasefire on social media and thanked Pakistan by name. He said Iran had accepted in response to the brotherly request of PM Sharif. That is extraordinary language for a foreign minister confirming a pause in an active war. But here is what makes Pakistan's position even more complicated than it already looks. The ceasefire that Sharif brokered immediately fell into dispute from multiple directions at once. Iran says Lebanon is included in the ceasefire terms. The United States says it isn't. Israel has continued strikes there that killed hundreds. Iran has responded by closing the strait again and suggesting it has placed sea mines in the waterway. Trump went on Truth Social and accused Iran of being dishonorable. Iran's parliament speaker posted his own preconditions for even beginning talks. And Pakistan, the mediator, is being squeezed from every side while simultaneously deploying its own naval ships to escort Pakistani commercial vessels through the Gulf under an operation it called Muhafiz-ul-Bar. Pakistan launched that naval escort mission because roughly 90% of its oil imports come through that same waterway that is currently being used as a geopolitical weapon. Pakistan declared a 4-day workweek for government employees. It closed schools for 2 weeks to conserve energy reserves. Its fuel prices surged more than 20% in the first days of the war alone, then climbed again in early April by an additional 55% for diesel and 43% for gas. This is not an abstract diplomatic exercise for Islamabad. This is survival. And that is exactly why Pakistan's mediation carries a different weight than what Oman or Qatar or Turkey could offer in this conflict. Pakistan's economy does not allow it the luxury of failure here. 5 million Pakistani workers are in the Gulf right now, sending home roughly $38 billion a year in remittances. Those workers and those remittances are the financial spine of a country that is already under IMF supervision. If this war continues and the Gulf destabilizes further, Pakistan doesn't just lose prestige, it loses the economic oxygen that keeps its government functional. In my view, this is why Pakistan was Iran's preferred mediator, and why Tehran calculated correctly in choosing Islamabad. A broker with existential stakes in the outcome has every incentive to push both sides harder than any neutral party would. Pakistan cannot afford to let these talks fail. That structural reality is its greatest diplomatic asset. What we are watching in Islamabad this weekend is not just diplomacy. It is a country using the urgency of its own position as leverage to reshape its place in the world. Analysts at Chatham House have noted that Pakistan has historically fallen behind India in South Asia's competition for influence. The mediation has, at least temporarily, inverted that dynamic entirely. Pakistan is now the convening power between the world's largest economy and one of the Middle East's most consequential states. Whatever happens inside that hotel in Islamabad, that fact alone is already a shift worth paying attention to. Pakistan has played this kind of role before. In 1971, Pakistani President Yahya Khan facilitated Kissinger's secret flight to Beijing, the mission that opened US-China relations and reshaped the Cold War. Pakistan was chosen then, according to Kissinger's own aide Winston Lord, because it was a friend to both sides simultaneously. That same logic applies today. Pakistan borders Iran. It has a defense pact with Saudi Arabia. It has rebuilt its relationship with Washington. And it has deep ties to Beijing, whose foreign minister met with Pakistan's top diplomat just weeks ago to coordinate pressure on both sides. Pakistan didn't stumble into this mediation role. It arrived here through geography, deliberate positioning, and 5 decades of knowing how to be trusted by people who distrust each other. But positioning alone doesn't resolve the hard problem sitting at the center of this crisis. And the hard problem, the one that every expert agrees could derail everything, is not Lebanon, and it is not sanctions. It is 21 miles of water, and the question of who controls them. Iran wants to charge ships a toll to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Let that sit for a moment. Not just to keep the strait open on its terms during a ceasefire, not just to slow traffic as leverage during negotiations. Iran is proposing, as part of a long-term peace deal, that vessels pay a fee to guarantee safe passage through a waterway that carries 20% of the world's oil and gas. The United Arab Emirates Minister of Industry put it plainly on LinkedIn this week. He said the Strait of Hormuz is not open. Access is being restricted, conditioned, and controlled. He called it coercion. He noted that under international maritime law, the strait is a natural passage guaranteed to all nations as a matter of right, not a privilege to be granted, withheld, or weaponized. The United States is demanding the strait open as free waters, with no tolls. Iran is holding firm to the position that its armed forces must coordinate passage through the waterway, and that compensation for the war it endured is a legitimate part of any settlement. This is not a small gap to bridge. This is a fundamental disagreement about who controls the most important energy corridor on the planet, and the economic numbers attached to that disagreement are staggering. Before this war began, between 130 and 160 ships passed through the strait every day. In the days since the ceasefire was announced, the number dropped to two ships in a single day. Through a waterway that normally moves roughly 12 to 15 million barrels of crude oil daily, according to analysts tracking the conflict. Lloyd's List, the Maritime Intelligence Service, reported this week that more than 600 vessels are currently stranded in the Middle East Gulf region. Their analysts estimated that even if the strait reopened completely tomorrow, it would take more than 10 days just to clear the backlog. Oil is trading above $95 a barrel today. Inflation data out of the United States in March already shows the direct fingerprints of the energy shock this war has produced. In Asia, where roughly 90% of the oil that passes through Hormuz is destined, the pain is considerably sharper. Japan, South Korea, and China were all watching equity markets give back gains this week as uncertainty over the strait's future hardened. South Korea dispatched a special envoy to Iran to negotiate the release of its stranded ships and crews. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency weeks ago. These are not abstract projections. These are things happening right now, in factories and fuel queues, in countries that have no vote in whatever gets decided inside that hotel in Islamabad. Capital Economics has estimated that Gulf states could lose between 10 and 15% of GDP if this conflict drags on for 3 months or more. Qatar suspended LNG export shipments in the early days of the war. Saudi Arabia's pipelines that bypass the strait, including the East-West pipeline connecting its oil fields to the Red Sea, have become critical precisely because the primary route is not functioning. But those pipelines have limits. They were designed as supplemental routes, not as full replacements for the volume that Hormuz normally carries. And here is where the Iranian toll proposal becomes something more than a negotiating demand. It becomes a structural question about the future of how global energy trade is organized. If Iran succeeds in establishing even a modified version of this toll system, even if framed as a security coordination fee, it would mean that one country has ongoing influence over the cost of passage through a choke point that the entire global economy depends on. Capital economics analysts said in a report this week that such a system would give Iran de facto control over a critical artery for energy trade and introduce a new and permanent source of geopolitical risk to the world economy. That risk does not disappear when a ceasefire is signed. It becomes embedded in the deal itself. The U.S. negotiating position is that this is a red line: no tolls, no Iranian coordination requirement, free passage as a matter of international law. Iran's position is that the strait runs along its coastline, it has a legal basis for involvement in passage coordination, and that compensation for the war it endured is legitimate. Both positions have their own internal logic. Neither is obviously irrational on its face, but they are, right now, in a room in Islamabad, fundamentally incompatible. Trump said this week he thinks the talks will go quickly. He said we're going to find out in about 24 hours. Analysts at Xinhua's international desk reported that Chinese academic Zhang Jie, dean of the School of International Studies at Xi'an International Studies University, framed the risk directly. If neither side gives the other an exit this weekend, the ceasefire could be suspended and the war could reignite. So this is the math that Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner walked into Islamabad to solve. It is not a math problem with an obvious answer. It is a negotiation between two sides that have been at war for 40 days, that deeply distrust each other, where the technical experts who might find compromise language have largely been removed from the picture. Trump fired most of his Middle Eastern specialists before this crisis began, and dozens of Iran's top officials were killed in the strikes. What both sides have instead is political leadership with enormous domestic pressure and very little room to show weakness. And sitting between them, walking proposals back and forth through hotel corridors, is Pakistan, a country that helped Kissinger reach China in secret in 1971, that helped mediate the framework that enabled Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan through the UN-led Geneva Accords of 1988, and that is now attempting something arguably harder than either of those. The question that the next 24 to 48 hours will begin to answer is not just whether these talks succeed, it is whether the framework that emerges, deal or no deal, reshapes the rules by which the global energy system operates for the next decade. Let's be clear about what we know and what we don't. As of today, April 11th, 2026, the talks are happening. Both delegations are inside the Serena Hotel in Islamabad's Red Zone, a five-star property surrounded by miles of security checkpoints, military vehicles, and closed streets in a city that has declared a public holiday to enforce a lockdown around these negotiations. The ceasefire technically holds on the Gulf side. No new attacks were reported in the strait overnight, but the Strait of Hormuz is still not functionally open. Just 2 ships passed through it yesterday. Before the war, the number was between 130 and 160 every single day. Lebanon is still being struck. Iran still calls that a ceasefire violation. The United States and Israel still say Lebanon is a separate conflict. That disagreement has not been resolved. It is one of the conditions Iran set before talks could formally begin. Trump said we would know the outcome within 24 hours. Iran's Supreme National Security Council warned before leaving for Islamabad that their hands remain upon the trigger. 3 scenarios are in play right now, and they lead to very different worlds. The first is a partial deal, an agreement that extends the ceasefire, creates some framework for coordinated passage through the strait, and defers the hardest questions: nuclear enrichment, sanctions, Lebanon, compensation, into a longer negotiation track that plays out over months. This is the most likely near-term outcome if both sides decide they need more time and neither wants to be blamed for a breakdown. The second is a breakdown. Talks collapse, the ceasefire expires on April 22nd, and the United States resumes strikes. Trump has been explicit about this. He told the New York Post that U.S. warships are being reloaded with the best ammunition, even better than before, and that if there is no deal, they will be used, and used very effectively. A breakdown scenario would likely push oil prices sharply higher and trigger the kind of economic contraction in Gulf and Asian economies that Capital Economics has been warning about for weeks. The third scenario is the one nobody expected going into this week: a substantive breakthrough on the core issues, particularly the strait, that produces something closer to a real settlement. This remains possible. Both sides sent their most senior people. That is a signal. You don't send your parliament speaker and your vice president to a meeting you plan to walk away from in the first hour. But here is what I think is the most important thing to understand about this entire situation. And it goes beyond the specific outcome in Islamabad. What this crisis has revealed is that the global energy system has a single physical choke point that one state can effectively weaponize in a way that disrupts the entire planet within days. Not weeks, days. Before the war began, 20% of the world's oil and gas passed through a stretch of water 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Within days of Iran closing it, fuel prices surged in the Philippines. Workers in India lost jobs. South Korean ships were stranded at sea. The U.S. Consumer Price Index moved in March in ways directly tied to what happened in a strait most Americans could not find on a map. That structural vulnerability does not get fixed by a ceasefire. It does not get fixed by a deal that reopens the strait under current conditions. The vulnerability is geographic. The strait is where it is. Iran's coastline is where it is. That does not change. What a deal can do, at best, is establish a framework that makes closing the strait politically and economically costly enough that no future government in Tehran considers it a first resort. What a deal cannot do is eliminate the leverage. The leverage is built into the geography. In my view, what Islamabad is really negotiating is not the end of this crisis. It is the terms under which the world agrees to live with this leverage, and the price Iran extracts for agreeing not to exercise it again. That is a different kind of negotiation than most people covering this story are describing. It is not about defeating Iran or making it surrender. It is about constructing a set of incentives and guarantees strong enough that both sides can tell their domestic audiences they didn't lose. Trump needs to say the strait is open and the nuclear threat is handled. Iran needs to say sanctions are lifted, its sovereignty is recognized, and it was not forced to capitulate. Pakistan needs to say it prevented an energy catastrophe and rebuilt its standing in global diplomacy. Whether all 3 of those things can be simultaneously true in the language of a single agreement, that is the puzzle the people inside that hotel are trying to solve right now. The ceasefire expires on April 22nd, 11 days from today. The last time the world had this kind of concentrated diplomatic pressure around a single deadline, in this region, with stakes this high, the outcome surprised almost everyone. It may do so again. We will be tracking every development as this story moves. If this gave you a clearer picture of what is actually at stake in Islamabad, not just who is in the room, but why the room exists at all, share it with someone who is trying to make sense of what they are seeing. And drop your take in the comments. Partial deal, breakdown, or real breakthrough. We will be back when we know more.